Disrespect rarely announces itself. It doesn't slam the door. It leaves it half open and walks away. It shows up as a delayed response, a comment that skips past you, a moment where your presence is technically acknowledged, but not truly recognized. And what makes it unsettling isn't the act itself. It's the quiet question that follows. Was that intentional? That uncertainty is where the damage happens. Because the mind doesn't like ambiguity. It fills in the gaps, usually turning inward. You replay the interaction. You adjust your tone next time. You become sharper, quieter, or smaller, sometimes without realizing it. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Disrespect threatens that acceptance, not because it defines you, but because it pressures you to question yourself. What makes disrespect powerful isn't volume, it's implication. It implies hierarchy. It suggests that someone else has placed themselves slightly above you, without ever saying it out loud. And the real danger isn't that they did it. It's whether you unconsciously agree. Most people think the solution is confrontation or confidence, but those are surface moves. This isn't a social problem, it's a psychological one. Disrespect activates old patterns, the urge to explain, to prove, to withdraw, or to dominate the moment just to restore balance. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Disrespect works the same way. If you don't examine what it triggers, it begins to steer your behavior without permission. This playbook isn't about retaliation. It's not about being liked or feared. It's about regaining authorship over how you interpret and respond to moments that quietly test your self-definition. Because the moment you understand why disrespect unsettles you is the moment it starts losing its power. The first impulse after disrespect is movement, a response, a correction, a defense. That impulse feels justified, almost necessary, but it's also predictable. And predictability is weakness when power is being tested. Disrespect is often subtle by design. It invites a reaction because reaction reveals leverage. The raised voice, the tightened posture, the rushed explanation, these are signals. They tell the other person where the pressure points are. To observe doesn't mean to tolerate. It means to slow the scene down internally while everything else keeps moving. You notice tone instead of arguing with it. You register timing instead of filling the silence. You watch what happens when you don't rush to repair the moment. Consider the situation where your contribution is brushed past without acknowledgement. The instinct is to restate it, louder, clearer, more forcefully. Observation asks a different question. Who benefits if I scramble for recognition right now? Often, the answer isn't you. Jung wrote, "The ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence." This kind of observation creates space, and space reveals intent. Some people retreat when they aren't met with immediate resistance. Others press further. Both responses are informative. When you don't react, you begin to see patterns instead of incidents. You notice who consistently interrupts, who only listens when challenged, who becomes uneasy when silence stretches a moment longer than expected. That information matters more than any quick reply ever could. Reaction is emotional currency. Once spent, it's gone. Observation, on the other hand, compounds. It sharpens perception. It restores internal balance before any external move is made. This rule isn't about passivity, it's about positioning, because the person who controls their response controls the tone of what comes next. And the moment you stop reacting on cue is the moment the interaction shifts, quietly but decisively. Once you stop reacting, something changes. The moment stretches, the noise fades, and in that quiet, a new question replaces the old one. Not why did they do that, but how often does this happen? Observation doesn't just slow the moment, it widens it. What first felt personal begins to look familiar, and familiarity is the doorway to clarity. That's where the playbook moves next. Disrespect feels personal because it targets your sense of position, but focusing on the person keeps you trapped inside the moment. Focusing on the pattern pulls you above it. Carl Jung wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order." Disrespect is no different. What appears random often follows a structure. A single dismissive moment can be brushed off. A pattern cannot. You begin to notice timing. It happens when attention shifts, when stakes rise, when your presence quietly challenges an unspoken hierarchy. The behavior repeats, but never identically, just consistently enough to create doubt. That doubt is part of the mechanism. When you fixate on who is doing it, you personalize the damage. You analyze their mood, their intent, their history. But patterns don't require interpretation. They only require recognition. Jung warned, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Judgment feels decisive, but it's shallow. Pattern recognition is slower and far more useful. Notice who interrupts only certain people, who withholds acknowledgement selectively, who changes tone depending on the audience. These aren't accidents, they're strategies, often unconscious, but effective. And here's the darker truth. Patterns persist because they work. They rely on your uncertainty, on your willingness to question yourself instead of the structure, on your hope that this time it was just a misunderstanding. Once you name the pattern internally, something shifts. You stop negotiating with each moment as if it's new. You stop granting the benefit of the doubt to something that has already proven itself consistent. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about reclaiming clarity. Because the moment you see the pattern, you're no longer reacting to disrespect. You're responding to information. And information, when held calmly, is power. Recognizing the pattern changes how you see the situation, but it also changes how you see yourself. Because once the behavior is no longer a mystery, the discomfort doesn't disappear. It relocates. It turns inward. And that's where the real work begins. Disrespect doesn't just come from the outside. It echoes. It stirs parts of you that usually stay quiet until they're provoked. Carl Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. What surfaces in moments of disrespect isn't random, it's familiar. Maybe it's the urge to explain yourself too thoroughly, hoping clarity will restore balance. Maybe it's withdrawal, a controlled silence that looks calm on the surface but simmers beneath. Or maybe it's a sudden edge in your voice, sharper than the situation seems to require. These responses aren't flaws. They're signals. Disrespect exposes the strategies you learned long ago to regain footing when your position feels threatened. The problem isn't having these responses, it's being unaware of them. Jung observed, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Ignoring these reactions doesn't neutralize them. It gives them autonomy. Consider how quickly the body reacts before the mind catches up. The tightened jaw, the shortened breath, the internal monologue that continues long after the interaction ends. That's not about the other person anymore. That's your inner structure revealing itself. The danger isn't anger or restraint, it's unconscious repetition. When you don't examine your response, you carry it forward. You replay it. You adjust future behavior around a single moment of discomfort. Awareness interrupts that loop. When you recognize your own pattern, overcompensating, retreating, asserting prematurely, you regain choice. You stop mistaking impulse for instinct. Disrespect loses leverage the moment you understand what it awakens in you. Because what you can observe in yourself, you no longer have to obey. And that quiet refusal, internal, deliberate, is where real control begins. Once you recognize the pattern around you and the reactions within you, a deeper leverage point appears. Not in what was said, not in what was done, but in what it meant to you. Because meaning is the hinge everything else swings on. Disrespect doesn't destabilize you because it happens. It destabilizes you because of the meaning you assign to it, often instantly and often without question. Carl Jung wrote, "We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become." That choice begins with interpretation. In the space between an action and your response, a silent decision is made. You decide whether the moment defines your value, your position, or your future behavior. Most people don't realize they're deciding at all. They accept the first story that forms. I was diminished. I wasn't taken seriously. This says something about me. But meaning is not inherent. It's constructed. Disrespect often masquerades as a verdict, when in reality it's a signal about dynamics, insecurity, timing, or unspoken competition. When you confuse signal for judgment, you hand over authority that was never requested. Jung warned, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Judging the moment too quickly collapses your options. Interpretation expands them. Consider how differently you move when you view disrespect as information rather than condemnation. Your posture changes. Your urgency dissolves. You stop rushing to correct the record. That pause is not weakness. It's authorship. When you control meaning, response becomes secondary. You no longer react to restore ego or status. You respond, if at all, to align with intent. This is where many lose ground. They try to control behavior without first controlling narrative. They speak before they decide what the moment represents. But the most stable position is internal. When the meaning is yours, no external action can rush you into defense or escalation. Disrespect thrives on assumed agreement. The moment you refuse that agreement, the interaction shifts, not because you said more, but because you needed to say less. And from that position, every response becomes optional. Once you decide what the moment means, urgency disappears. You're no longer reacting to discomfort. You're choosing a direction. That's when response stops being emotional and starts being strategic. Not every instance of disrespect deserves a reply, and not every reply deserves words. Carl Jung wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." Strategy lives in that space, where action is measured, not moralized. There are 3 responses that preserve control when used deliberately: silence, precision, and distance. None of them are passive. All of them are intentional. Silence is the refusal to perform. It denies the moment the reaction it often seeks. When you don't rush to fill the gap, the dynamic becomes visible. Some people retreat, others overextend. Silence reveals which is which. Precision is restraint with direction. Few words, calm delivery, no explanation beyond what's necessary. Precision doesn't argue, it clarifies. It signals awareness without escalation. It corrects without inviting debate. Then there is distance, the most misunderstood response. Distance isn't avoidance, it's recalibration. You reduce access, you narrow engagement. You stop offering energy where it isn't respected. Jung observed, where your fear is, there is your task. Distance is often feared because it feels like loss. In reality, it's alignment. The mistake most people make is choosing these responses impulsively. Silence used to punish becomes visible. Precision delivered emotionally turns defensive. Distance applied without clarity feels reactive. Strategy requires timing. You don't use the same response every time. You observe which preserves your internal balance and alters the dynamic with the least effort. The goal isn't dominance, it's self-command. When your responses are chosen, not triggered, you become unpredictable in the best way. Calm, measured, unavailable to manipulation. Disrespect depends on emotional access. Silence limits it. Precision defines it. Distance removes it. And once access is controlled, the interaction no longer dictates your behavior. You do. Silence works until it doesn't. Precision clarifies until it's ignored. Distance creates space, but sometimes the pattern survives it. When disrespect continues despite your restraint, the situation reveals its final truth. The issue is no longer the moment, it's the relationship. Persistent disrespect is never accidental. By the time it repeats, it has become an agreement, one that benefits someone else more than it benefits you. Carl Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When the reaction is consistently corrosive, transformation is unavoidable." Redefining the relationship doesn't require confrontation. It requires adjustment. You change the terms quietly, structurally, and without announcement. You stop offering unearned access. You lower emotional investment. You disengage from unnecessary exchanges. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. One of the darker realizations is that some people only respect boundaries they didn't help create. When explanation fails, structure speaks. Jung observed, loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. When respect is absent, communication becomes performative. Redefinition restores honesty, not outwardly, but internally. This is where many hesitate. They wait for validation, for acknowledgement, for an apology that would justify change. But waiting keeps the old agreement alive. Redefinition doesn't seek permission. It may look like fewer conversations, shorter interactions, neutral tone. It may look like redirecting energy elsewhere, where reciprocity exists. What matters is consistency. Disrespect persists when access remains unchanged. Once access is adjusted, the dynamic either corrects itself or dissolves. And both outcomes are acceptable. Because the purpose of redefining the relationship isn't distance for its own sake. It's alignment. It's choosing environments and exchanges that don't require you to armor yourself constantly. When you redefine the relationship, you're no longer asking to be respected. You're deciding where respect is required for access. And that decision, quiet, firm, irreversible, is the final boundary. When the relationship has been redefined, something settles. The noise fades. The tension loosens, and what's left is quieter, but more revealing. Because once disrespect no longer dictates your behavior, a deeper question emerges. Who are you when you're no longer reacting at all? There's a moment that comes after you stop engaging with disrespect, not dramatic, not visible to anyone else. It's subtle, almost unsettling in its calm. Carl Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Disrespect often keeps people externally focused, reactive, oriented toward control, correction, or defense. When that loop breaks, attention turns inward. You notice you're no longer rehearsing conversations that haven't happened. You're not adjusting your behavior in anticipation of dismissal. You stop scanning for signs of approval or resistance. That absence of vigilance is the shift. Internal authority doesn't announce itself. It's felt as steadiness, as reduced urgency, as the ability to sit inside a moment without needing to manage how it unfolds. This is where many misunderstand the outcome. They expect confidence to feel louder, more assertive. But real authority is quieter. It doesn't chase recognition because it's no longer organized around it. Jung observed, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That becoming isn't about dominance. It's about coherence. When your internal standards are clear, disrespect becomes less tempting to engage with. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer negotiates your identity. You begin to choose your words carefully, or not at all. You recognize when engagement adds nothing. You conserve energy without guilt. And perhaps most importantly, you stop needing the moment to resolve itself. Closure becomes internal, validation unnecessary. This section of the playbook isn't about others anymore. It's about you regaining authorship over your inner posture, so that no external behavior can rush you into compromise. When internal authority is restored, respect is no longer demanded. It's implied by access. And from that position, the conclusion becomes inevitable, not as advice, but as recognition of what's already changed. Once internal authority stabilizes, something subtle happens in the outer world. Not because you announce a change, but because consistency has weight. People respond differently when you no longer negotiate your position. Disrespect often survives on ambiguity, on mixed signals, on emotional availability without clear boundaries. When those elements disappear, the environment recalibrates. Carl Jung wrote, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. When you know, fewer people attempt to define you." This shift isn't dramatic. No apologies arrive. No acknowledgement is given. Instead, tone changes. Timing adjusts. Certain behaviors quietly fade because they no longer land. Not everyone responds the same way. Some become more measured, sensing restraint they can't quite explain. Others pull back, uncomfortable with the loss of influence. A few may test the boundary once more, not aggressively, but cautiously. That test is information. When your response doesn't waver, when silence stays silent, precision stays calm, and distance stays intact, the dynamic resolves itself. Either respect emerges or access diminishes. Jung observed, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment than the unlived life of the parent." Unexpressed authority creates tension. Expressed authority creates structure. What changes most is your position within the interaction. You're no longer a variable. You're a constant. Predictable in values, unpredictable in reaction. That combination discourages manipulation. You don't explain your standards. You embody them, and embodiment communicates faster than words ever could. This is the unspoken signal. You are not available for negotiation about your worth, not through force, not through display, but through consistency. When that signal is clear, disrespect loses efficiency. It requires too much effort for too little return. And the few who persist reveal themselves, not as adversaries, but as misaligned, which makes the final decision simpler than it ever was before. Take the first step today. Notice one moment of disrespect. Do not react immediately, and observe instead. See what it reveals about the pattern, about yourself, and about the space you are willing to occupy. That small decision is the beginning of reclaiming everything the world cannot take from you, because respect is never demanded. It is only implied, and implied begins with you. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment your experience reclaiming control over disrespect, and subscribe for more insights. Thanks for watching.